if we want to make general remarks, but any kind of questions. And we are missing Brendan, who's here at Birkbeck, and the last couple of times he's organised a mic, and I don't know how to do that. So you can come up and use that microphone if you're not shy, but you have a quiet voice, or you can just shout out from where you are. Anyway, anybody at all. Go for it, and then.
Okay, I've just got a couple of questions.
We'll take sort of little groups of questions if you can handle that. Yeah, go.
First of all, how did it end? I mean, were these communes actually suppressed at some point by the state, or did they just fizzle out, or whatever?
Make sure everyone can hear the question.
Were there any attempts to form these communes by anybody apart from students? And a third, trivial but I think interesting question, I was intrigued by all this stuff about sort of the Taylorization of everyday life. And is this where Yevgeny Zamyatin got some of his ideas for a satirical novel from?
Okay,
I wanted to ask about the internal life of the communes. One of the things, as I understand it, that was always part of the Russian Revolution tradition, and certainly is present in Chernyshevsky, is an idea about the transformation of personal life, of sexuality, and so on. And so I was expecting to hear about communes that were rather more bohemian than the ones that you described, which seemed, perhaps this is just a matter of personal taste, but slightly priggish. But I was wondering how that fits with that tradition. You know, for example, Lenin in his conversation with Zetkin famously objects that all the young people are, obsessed with sex, or Kollontai talking about more collective ways of living which will undermine the couple, which she sees as a bad thing because people are only focused on one other person rather than on the collective. So I wondered, in these collectives, are people still in couple relationships, or are they organising their personal lives differently? How does that work?
Can you hear the questions at the back? Okay, fantastic. If anybody can't hear, just put your hand up and wave at me, and I'll tell people to speak up. And shall we get one? Yeah.
Follow on from that. How did one commune relate to another? In the sense of, what if someone in one got romantically involved with someone in another? Would this upset the dynamics in one or both of the communes? This sort of thing. And also, did they recruit from outside of, were they just mates who got together, or was there recruitment campaigns? Or so what you were saying, it seems like it was just a lot of people who like-minded who got together, like you get in various places outside of the political context.
Anybody else? Or there'll be plenty more chances. But do you want to? Okay, yeah. On you go.
Okay, I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible, so there's more discussion on the floor. First of all, let's take it backwards, I guess. How did they relate to one another? Well, the first thing to say, which I think answers a number of questions, is that obviously these aren't a uniformed group. This isn't a uniform mass. They don't, get their orders from on high. So there isn't one answer. They're all different. A lot of the student groups communes did discuss among one another. They had, in some occasions, kind of monthly meetups of different commune groups, and they kind of shared ideas there. Some commune groups tried to expand rather forcibly. Some were perhaps rather more genteel about it. So there's no one answer. But in terms of it becoming something, like I said, of a cultural meme, something that more people would experiment, especially towards the mid to late 20s, it's because they're involved in this cyclical relationship with the press, or the youth press in particular, where their ideas are being reported on, and then people are writing in and experimenting with their ideas and replicating the idea. So again, you can see why there isn't a uniform answer, because it kind of spirals into something that no one ever designed. Okay. Linked to that, sex. Again, there's no one answer. There's one commune, actually it's the Maklinsky Lane commune. They initially started off promoting something more akin to kind of colonized ideas of companionship, but also the idea that coupling and sex going off, together is something that will make individualism spread. So they therefore suggest that their love relationships should be more open. They shouldn't own one another. A couple of members then fall in love with each other. One member falls in love with someone from outside the commune, and they have huge debates about this for months on end. They eventually kind of get themselves out of this kind of compromise of their ideology, or the conflict of their ideology, by saying, maybe we can do what Trotsky said and create the smallest form of a socialist collective, i.e. a couple. So they therefore then, this particular commune allows marriage, but as they see it, marriage is something new, something old, something borrowed, and something red. They think it's revolutionary, but they've kind of compromised themselves in a way. So there are lots of these groups that are promoting something more akin to free love, but I've not come across people. I've not come across massive orgies or anything like that. I've come across them debating these ideas rather than sticking with them. Moving on, Taylorization, and yes, I think probably Zamyatin, where's that question come? I think probably Zamyatin was playing with this stuff precisely. And it is weird that this idea that is very capitalistic, this is how Henry Ford's factories are run, it takes on a very different social emphasis in the Soviet Union, this idea that you can rationalize and make everyday life for human beings and social life scientific. They're playing with that. The endings, they do end, obviously. Many of them are falling apart left, right and centre. They're bickering, like I said. One commune I found fell apart in 8 hours. But what's happening at the end of the 20s, they're becoming engaged with brigade teams. These are teams that are working in the factories as collective organisations. Being young idealists, they're trying to kind of play around with these new ideas, and they kind of end up compromising themselves increasingly. So actually, I expected to find quite a bloody ending. But many of the communes, many of the activists in the communes, go on to be members of the Komsomol. Some go into the party. One guy, or Valyezin himself actually, goes on to become a scientist and does something with corrosive metals that I just do not understand. But they become part of the system. They're not killed by Stalin. So in a way, their idealism and the idea of the commune almost fizzles out more than being another example of bloodshed in the Soviet Union. But I'll give way to some more questions.
Okay, just in this...
Non-students.
Oh yes,
do you want to get around and I can come back to it?
Yeah. I just want to say, in this electronic age, I think you've probably all put your addresses on Eventbrite or whatever, but if anybody's here and wants to give us their email to make sure they get emails about future things, there's a little piece of paper there which is non-cyber looking, and there we go. Any more questions, comments?
So you seem to have talked about sort of like spontaneous efforts towards socialism for those students. But then you mentioned as well the Workers' Club and this paper model of a building. And so I would like to hear more about those, for example, if you have.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah?
In the late 60s, some of you may remember the common expression in the press of the generation gap. Was there a lot of moral outrage from parents in this period, especially as in that time, presumably, some of the parents were even less educated than some of us were?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Can you tell us something about the social background of those young people who joined the communes? Was it more common among those who were peasants before, or workers, or even from the bourgeoisie?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so non-students, which links in with some of the other questions. This wasn't limited to students. I think it's in that student environment where it catches on as I've been calling it, a meme. But we are dealing with effectively a contingent of people that are all in or aspiring to be in the Komsomol. So they are all youths. They're not necessarily all students, but they are from that section of society. which kind of links to that point about generation. Yes, we're dealing with people that are expressly rejecting their family. They're expressly rejecting the kind of familial form and the idea of a bourgeois setup. I haven't come across examples where they had children in the commune, but I've come across examples where they're talking about having children and they said that the biological parents must give up their biological right to parenthood, and the child is the property, is clearly the wrong word here, but the property of the collective. So there's a generational thing embedded within this from the get-go. And the idea that some of these commune groups, the members might go back to the family, or in some cases send money back to the family, is a bad thing. They need to cut off ties on many occasions. So that's the key dynamic at play. Social background. Many of these young activists are partaking in what the Komsomol is promoting at this point, and that's the idea of writing mini diaries or mini biographies. Many in the Soviet Union would come to do this, where you'd have to write a kind of mini biography of your social background. So if you came from something more akin to the bourgeoisie, you'd have to reject your parents, you'd have to reject something in the past. But it also gave the opportunity to people to stress their working class background, or their working, or their kind of labouring country roots, if you will. So many of the kind of communards, these activists, were stressing that they came from a working class background or a poor rural background, and that this was their chance, particularly these students who often came into university because of these worker faculties. I'm sure there were some that were more middling, if you will, but it's not something that they talk about, because it's something that they have to hide, or it'd be a bit shameful to display one's bourgeois roots. So it's hard to give a precise answer, but there are many that are celebrating working class roots. In terms of the paper architecture, I've lost you, Leo. The paper architecture, the models, the working clubs. Part of what I was talking about today was really to say that these things have come from this milieu, this vibrant cultural revolution that's getting young people to do these crazy things, to try and make the revolution themselves. By the end of the 20s, there are architectural groups that are putting a lot of time and effort into these grander projects, stimulated by perhaps a second rebirth of collectivism at the end of the 20s, linked to the first 5-year plan. But it's impossible to go into all of these. I think if that's something that interests you, then I think the best place to start is to look at Narkomfin and Ginsberg's architectural designs there, and those intricate ideas of how you could design a stepping stone to socialism. But there were many of these grand projects on paper, didn't necessarily get funded. Some of the most exciting ideas, which Kollontai actually kind of predicted, would be these grand communal kitchens that could serve thousands of people at a time. The idea being that after work you go to a communal kitchen, you eat together, so therefore you could actually get rid of the bourgeois private kitchen. You wouldn't need a kitchen at home, everyone would eat together. So these things are being discussed, if not built.
Okay, there, and then there.
Thank you. It's fascinating, and you've talked about some issues like marriage or children, all these things that are being discussed. I wonder what are other issues or topics may cause conflict or disputes, and also if there's a case of violence or conflict, how do they deal with these things? And also another issue is about the health care, all those like medical and all these things. Are they part of the commune as well? Thank you.
There, yeah.
And you said that they were very kind of idealistic about putting Marxism into practice, and you did mention the thing from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Was there any sense in which kind of production relations and the way in which work and working life was organised part of their discussions as to how society was going to be organised? Because obviously it's one thing to have a cultural discussion, but a genuine social revolution is going to transform production relations and how the economy is organised. So to what extent did that play a part in what these communes were coming to organise?
Mhm.
Okay, shall we take...
Just one down.
Yeah, there's also somebody...
Yeah, so it sort of sounds like a kind of nightmarish call to residence. So did they intend, rather than just keeping one another in line, did they kind of intend to have any more kind of high-minded objective of what they could do as a group to mobilise to do something useful as opposed to just subsisting in a shared environment?
Yeah, I've got sort of two questions, and I think they follow on from what we were asked. The first thing is, given the situation of NEP, was the society starting very slightly to recover from basically 7 years of war and destruction, in which generalised want was pretty much dominant in society, then I would imagine what interests me firstly is, on issues, for example, even though revolutionaries were spreading the notion of women's equality and women's rights and women's self-emancipation, to what extent would a sexual division of labour found itself reproduced in the commune? To what extent were there attempts by the commune to undermine sexual divisions of labour? And was that possible in a society where, you know, modern means of birth control, etc., were not as available as they are today? So I'm wondering how sexism fared in the commune. The second question is slightly different, and it's just to, in a way, you present the communes, if you like, as an addendum to a political history of the revolution, and I understand that. And I'm just wondering how the commune, in terms of discussions in the communes, to what extent do they show indications that they were involved in the great debates of NEP, that they were lining up in terms of the arguments between the various oppositions and the party leadership, with, you know, opposition to Stalinism, with support for the various different groups of oppositionists on the left. And I'm wondering, was there any of that, or are they, if you like, apolitical in that sense?
Mm-hmm. And shall we... Yeah, go for it.
Yes, following on a little bit from there, I know sort of like in Moscow by 21 there's 865 communes in Moscow. Some were women only, some were based on professions, some were based on factories, and some were obviously based on universities. Could you tell us more about maybe some of why there was women-only sort of communes? And the bit you mentioned before about the sort of shared underwear, you know, in terms of some of the communes. I know that happened with the Moscow librarians, and also when there was ironing, they used to have an orchestra playing. So some of the ways they might have, you know, that bit of a sort of the way they changed Taylorism into sort of something a bit more sort of like optimising rather than maximising, which Taylorism became in the West, you know, so enjoyment with food chores and stuff.
Okay, back to you.
Okay, that's a range. Where to begin? Because it's fresh in my memory, coming back to some of your point here about how perhaps I've displayed these groups as outside the political. Well, actually, it's one thing that I don't want to do. I mean, yes, I've highlighted examples that kind of neatly sum up what they're doing. It's a nice way to do this, but I don't want to present them as utopian, as the Bolsheviks would understand utopianism, i.e. a bad thing. I want to present them as actually playing with the ideas of their day. And Cultural Revolution isn't deemed to be a lesser revolution, it's deemed to be deeply important to progressing the Bolshevik cause. So they are playing with live ammo, I would suggest. They, in terms of hot political topics, if we're talking about, say, the power struggle, again, there's no uniform answer here. There's no uniform pattern. But they are engaging and debating the ideas. One commune group, perhaps not the most politically astute, would actually fall behind some of Stalin's ideas, particularly the idea of socialism in one country, not because they inherently believe in the ideology, but because they're concerned with building socialism here and now in their one apartment. So the idea of getting it right at home before you start global revolution makes perfect sense to them. So again, they're not politically astute, but they are playing key political points here. Equally so, the Baliesin commune group actually, when they find out during the kind of power struggle, must be 26, when they found out that one of their professors is giving out work by Zinoviev, they go around and petition her to stop. And she retorts with something along the lines of, you could still walk under a table when I first met Lenin, suggesting that they were just young little toddlers playing at politics. So they are engaging in these ideas, they are discussing them, they have opinions. They're not necessarily heightened, politically conscious, at the party level, but they are working within that context. Linked to the point you made about sexual division of labour. Again, there are a number of compromises that come into play here. There's lots of talk about sharing social duties, about sharing domestic duties, lots of talk about sharing the housework. Again, as I hinted perhaps in the talk, there are far more examples than I can show where they fall back on certain gendered visions, traditional gendered visions. Women were far more susceptible to being criticised for having excessively kind of nice decoration in their sleeping quarters, for instance, to sign that they're bourgeois, whereas the men in their books are austere and proper. And there's a sense in that, in a sense, the revolution is gendered male. It is coloured male in many respects. These women, to be presented and to be taken seriously, they have to reject the baba. This is the idea of a naive peasant woman. They're always liable to be criticised for being the baba. So often, it's part of the trend that they cut their hair short. But it's almost as though they're having to be more male in many respects. They're choosing to do it, but it seems like culturally the revolution is gendered male, and they're having to play ball to be taken seriously. In terms of the link to that, I've lost you, but in terms of the all-female, all-women commune groups, I've actually only found these mostly around the end of the 20s, when we're dealing with the groups that are becoming caught up in the worker brigades. And I think this is ostensibly because they're moving into factories and they're moving into, again, far more male environments. And some of them are kind of taken women-only communes as a form of protection, as a form of proving that they can function in this world. And they undertake a lot of teasing and kind of mockery from what they refer to as older workers. Again, I don't know how old they really are, but they're seen as certainly old compared to them. Which I guess kind of links to one of the points about conflict. Again, lots of the conflicts did come back to a gendered point. The Mokrinsky Lane commune, when one of those marriages, or the marriage I mentioned, when it actually falls apart, all the women take the woman's side and all the men take the man's side, and they actually have a huge debate about I guess what we would understand as gender issues, and that proves to be one of the problems. I haven't come across any issues of violence linked to those debates. I mean, fairly acrimonious language, but not fisticuffs. It must have been somewhere, but I haven't come across that. You mentioned health as well. This Taylorist timetable also made room for cleanliness. It was important to be cleanly. To be cleanly was to be modern and socialist, a modern socialist development. And they, one of the commune groups also like to compare themselves to the various statistics that they found in the newspapers. Again, this is a modern, rational world they're trying to build. There's always statistics. So they find the statistics for the number of people that change their underwear once a week, and they compare themselves to that. They compare themselves to the number of people that clean their teeth and get tooth powder or whatever it is, and they say, oh, we're doing better than them. They're almost trying to kind of quantify how much better they are than this average statistic. So health is used to define the life of these communes as well. Perhaps I'll just answer one more of those questions. there was the point about work and life. In some of the student communes, actually, they were very keen to criticise the Consommant for promoting only socialist agitation and not concentrating on their studies. So Balliaism would say we have to take seriously study and agitation together, so he would promote the two. The same when it comes to those communes outside the dormitory. They would view collective work life and collective domestic life as one thing. Culture in the domestic sphere and culture at work should come together. This should be something we celebrate together, which again makes understandable the fact that they become embroiled in these brigades with the first 5-year plan. Maybe I'll pause there if you've got another round. Or
Yeah. Okay.
Just to pick up, I think it was part of your question about birth control. Were there lots of abortions?
That is information that isn't easy to come across. I forgot the birth control point. I mean, they do discuss birth control, and there are again other kind of, I guess, typical, slightly gendered points to it where they suggest that condoms aren't that enjoyable and such things, and the responsibility tends to fall on the women. In terms of were there abortions, I haven't come across honest, open, overt reports of it. I've come across discussions and concern with the increased abortion rate, which was being talked about in the press. Maybe we can read something into that, but that's the kind of level of textual detail that I haven't come across. I don't think the documents will give us.
Yeah.
I was wondering if people living in the commune have an idea about the order of the commune. Is that a spatial thing or a kind of ideological? So they have how do they conceive the relationship between that space and the space outside?
Yeah.
What is the, thank you for the talk, what is the geographical spread of these communes? And you mentioned the Nevsky Prospect, and they stole some alcohol. Maybe it was to do with because the net people, they're quite rich and have a lot of alcohol. Maybe they wanted to get rid of the alcohol, because it shouldn't be for everyone, and these might be a stash hidden away somewhere. So maybe they're trying to even up the field.
I'm sure they claim that.
Yes, so where exactly? Because I think in Petersburg, in St. Petersburg, or where are they?
Yeah, shall I take those?
Yeah, well, William.
Just following on this point about the boundary between these communes and the rest of society, and given also the presence of students in some of these, was there or have you detected any say, ridicule or opposition to or questioning about the nature of these communes and maybe their idealism or something like that?
Well, while you're thinking about that, I mean, just a point about the abortion issue is that firstly, abortion is legalized in Russia in 1920, which is very, very far ahead of most of, or if not all of Europe. So, this is a really revolutionary measure when it happens in 1920. And it's what's certainly true nationally, whatever the material you've studied can tell you about those communes, but what's certainly true nationally is that the epidemic of abortion being used as a means of contraception by the end of the 20s is like a serious, it's seriously worrying the health officials and the people who are dealing with women's health and so on. And I also just wanted to put in in defence of the communes who, I mean, in many ways you think, what an insufferable bunch of so-and-sos. But, I mean, on the health thing, as I think you've explained, but I mean, ironing your underwear, cleaning your teeth and all that in Russia in the 1920s, these are matters of life and death in a country which has suffered cholera epidemics and so on. So, 3 cheers for health and so on. And I mean, just a question from me. living space in Russia has always been extremely short. People came into these barracks before the revolution, and writing about modern day Russia, you see statistics of millions and millions of people, up to 2016 living in communal apartments in the most difficult, which causes difficulties with your neighbours, to put it mildly. So you have 3 or 4 families effectively living in a flat up till today. To what is there a sense in which these communes are just kind of making do with what they've got? Does that come into it? And over to you again.
Okay. Good question. Where shall I begin? Take them in order. So boundaries. I think yes, in some cases boundaries are quite distinct. Sometimes, again with the student examples, they would almost look down upon their peers outside the commune room, especially if they are leaving 184 bottles of alcohol outside. So in that sense, the boundary is quite distinct. In terms of the Makunsky Lane commune, again, they're often talking about what the area is like. So they're talking about how this is a disreputable area where one is likely to come across prostitutes and be kind of mugged with a knife. They talk about themselves almost being kind of bastions of hope in that setting. They're happy to be in that setting because it's where they can do good. Actually, that links to a previous question. They're not just concerned with being isolated in that boundary. They want that boundary to perfect them, to make a new Soviet person, so that then they can send themselves out as examples to society, to partake in agitation work, to partake in other revolutionary activities. So there is a distinct boundary in some sense, but that's to perfect the individuals within so that they can therefore go out. Where are they? I think initially we can say Petrograd into Leningrad is the heart of these groups, but they spread across urban settings across European Russia into modern day Ukraine, and many of them again becoming mixed up with brigades, end up working in wherever there's industry or urban settings. Some of them set up in coal mines and such places. So it's an idea that's replicated, but the heart of it is perhaps initially Petrograd, and then Moscow. Critics, yes, there's one thing I clearly didn't have time to touch upon in the talk. They have a lot of critics from older workers, which I've hinted at, and that's again because there's a generational thing going on there. The youth are very annoyed at this point that those that benefit from the apprenticeship system are those that established work, and it's keeping them out of the factories before the first 5-year plan. So there's a kind of generational annoyance and tension point there. So that then when part of the first 5-year plan there's more of these groups filtering into the industry, there's a ready-made point of conflict and tension, and there's kind of accusations and criticisms going back and forth. Again, all based on a kind of generational tension. There are then also people that are criticising these groups, even in the press, which I said are kind of parts of the Komsomol press are enamoured with these groups. There are all the time people that are criticising them, saying yes, it's good that there's this activism from below, but they are very haphazard. They could go in the wrong direction. It's the sort of thing that needs to be managed more carefully. And there are various kind of caricatures that I can't show you, where they kind of show these communes kind of causing chaos in their settings. So there's an underlying criticism at the same time. So there's a relative openness in the press in the 20s, and I stress the relative. So there are different opinions on these groups being forged, but obviously increasingly as we enter the 30s, those critical voices gain more attention and more traction. So coming back to general communal living or collective living by the very circumstances of limited housing, always been a problem in Russia. The communal apartment, the kommunalka, becomes a key form of living across the Soviet Union. Richard Stites, a famous historian, called this the, how did he put it, the compromise vision of communalism or something along those lines. So to some extent, these commune groups are working out of necessity, but they view that necessity as part of an ideological mission. So there is limited housing and there is a poor housing stock. But by repurposing that space, by fixing those drafty windows, they think that they are making the material progression to socialism. They think that they can physically build socialism, and by doing that they're making a more modern socialist environment. So in a way, necessity and ideology are one thing, and it's that they wouldn't necessarily notice the distinction in quite the same way. But they are very conscious of what they're doing. They're not falling into it accidentally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. We have time. We have the room. Somebody here, just want to say that piece of paper, if anybody wants to get emails, is with William. So see him at the end if you didn't see the piece of paper. And then, yeah.
Hi, it seems, just a comment really, rather than a comment on my comment, if you like. It seems that this idea that these things are essentially progressive things, which were then brought to an end by this bad guy, Stalin, eventually. They ended in the 30s. There seems another way of looking at it, though. It seems that, in many ways, although they're trying to prefigure a kind of a positive and progressive communal living, actually this sublimation of I into the we, and it's almost like prefiguring totalitarianism, effectively. So that actually they're very easily incorporated into Stalinism when it comes along. So it's actually, there's a sense in which these things are absolutely not progressive at all. And just on a personal note, I'd rather die than be one of these. I would absolutely rather die. I live in the street before I live in one of these communes. And it's interesting that this idea that this sort of commune living is kind of, not surprised the older workers poured scorn on it, because it's just, why on earth would anyone want to live in this hideous, permanent student house for the rest of their life? It's a nightmare for me.
Thank you for that. You've reminded me that just because there was a conversation earlier about Zamyatin, so if anybody, right, but just in case anyone doesn't know of the novel, I think everybody was assuming that everybody knows, but there's a novel by Yevgeny Zamyatin, who was a fantastic novelist, in my view, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, worked in Newcastle before the First World War, returned to take part in the revolution, and when all the super optimism of the prolet cult and so on started in 1920, he wrote this wonderful, in my view, novel, We. It's called, the title is We, and that is, I mean, there's letters from Zamyatin where he makes very clear, to answer your point, Andy, he's taking the mickey out of this we that you've mentioned. It's an amazing piece of critique from 1920. Strongly recommend it.
You can see where George Orwell actually got his ideas.
And Orwell actually acknowledges Zamyatin somewhere in a letter and says that he's read Zamyatin. He's much darker and more pessimistic than Zamyatin, perhaps because of the time he was writing in.
In my reading about different forms of collective living, they all seem to be, at best, disappointing. I mean, the temptation is to say, well, it's just there was too much scarcity in these conditions, but even in situations where there isn't that much relative scarcity, I would say the kibbutzim in Israel, quite the opposite limitations of that Zionist ideology. There were sort of some successes and also some problems that were kind of fallen apart in recent decades. People always felt they were a bit restrictive, and so that sort of the one collective experiment that's worked throughout human history seems to have been the kind of ways hunter-gatherers live. We're not going to go into details about that, but the ways that nomadic hunter-gatherers live and those who still live in Africa is very much tied in with certainly collectivism, equality, sharing, everything, but very much tied in with ritual and celebration. And so the question I want to ask is whether any of these communes ever got into sort of kind of something like that. We all know about the May Days and things they celebrated in the Soviet Union, but I mean, did they ever try to find some way, even slightly more religious type way, more ritualistic type way, create some collectivity amongst themselves through socialist rituals or something like that? Anything come close to that? I'm not saying it doesn't sound great, but it might maybe that.
Just anyone who hasn't talked to it.
You mentioned that they're in Russia, in Petersburg and in Moscow. What about in Baku or in Kazan or like the periphery of Central Asia? Are they spreading out that far, or what's these things?
Yeah. I mean, I can't resist adding to that, actually. I mean, I'd be very interested to know, were there experiments at setting up communes in the countryside? Because all the examples, I think somebody here spoke about places which were not students, which were workers and so on, but does this go into the countryside, and what sort of difficulties do they confront there? Back to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, to the starting point, I mean, I completely agree. I think what we have here is a story of optimism, a story of utopianism, a story of wonderful youthfulness, in a way. Well, that's what I thought at first, anyway. And I thought there was something to learn from these groups, and then as I got to study them, I realised that actually I couldn't stand them either. But I think what you have here is a story that shows the arrogance of modernity, and they're fueled by modern socialism. They're fueled by the idea that they can rationalise their life, they can scientificise their life, to make up a word. That they can just make it better by using these very prosaic scientific methods. So in a way, whilst they're not the same as Stalin, I think they can still be thought of as part of the dark side of modernity. They're not against a statist vision. They're not against a strong state forcing through these modern ideas and getting those people that are living wrong, the arrogance to say they're living wrong, to live right. They would agree with that. So I don't disagree with this point that they should be severed from Stalin. And I think there is a connection of sorts. Rituals, celebrations. Well, they partake in the rituals and celebrations that are kind of common in the 20s. Some of them are partaking in red baptisms, which some of you in the room may have read in a book called Revolutionary Dreams by Richard Stites. This idea that you basically appropriate baptism, but you name yourself or take on a revolutionary name in a kind of socialist ceremony. So you kind of this kind of faux religious act becomes something very socialist. So they're participating in those sorts of things. But they haven't necessarily, as far as I'm aware, come up with their very own rituals. They're playing on a theme that already exists in that sense. Again, coming back to the question of where, I mean, there are kind of isolated examples of them going out to as far as Baku. I can't remember the statistics and numbers. We're talking about far fewer, as opposed to a kind of condensed mass in Petrograd, in Moscow, in Kiev, and such places. But I think there are a few copycat type groups developing from memory. Again, that's something very late, mixing with the kind of brigade work of the first 5-year plan. So it might be seen as something slightly compromised from the original communes that I've talked about today. The countryside, well, we do know that there are what were called communes in the countryside, very much more state-driven, state-sanctioned. If we're thinking about the communes I've talked about today as something more of an activist group, more of a spontaneous group, there were some groups that did try to go out to the countryside and form this life and tell those damn stupid peasants how to live properly, how to, clearly you don't know how to grow, vegetables, you've been doing this your whole life, we young whippersnappers can come along and tell you, sort of thing. There were examples of that, but again, they don't seem to have hung around very long, so I presume they got told where to go. Which also,
is that during the first 5-year plan or before?
That's early days of first 5-year plan, before the kind of huge movements to the countryside, kind of preceding that in a way. Yeah.
Okay. And then
Okay, just working backwards from what you were saying about this possibly prefiguring Stalin, but you also presented it as a combination of idea and necessity as a model of scientific living from the point of view of the people who participated on it. But early on in the student sector. I mean, how did people who didn't live this way live? How did the other students live who weren't part of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you just mentioned trying to sort of politicize peasants. I think you mentioned something before about kind of disruption, but it doesn't sound as though there's been much functionality to this beyond living well for its own sake. You know, presumably they could have achieved something with their kind of collective consciousness of 10, 20 people and their labour, their kind of organised labour, some political aim or cleaning up the sweeping the streets or whatever they might want to do to make this appear to be a virtuous thing to outsiders beyond just having clean bed clothes.
Okay, yeah.
You've told a story that seems very focused on Russia, and the Russian story seems to have a nice narrative. On the other hand, there are revolutions happening elsewhere in 1917, 1918. So I was wondering if there's any kind of sharing of ideas across borders that take place in the formation of the communes, and even if there's any exchanges of people in the communal sort of, is there some kind of an international communal sort of exchange in culture?
Okay, just I'm feeling that in terms of questions, certainly we've had quite a few. So, I mean, should I take your? It's very hard to do this with such a big group, but I'll take your collective kind of whatever. Do people want to make sort of general comments or whatever, and then we ask Andy to sort of come back in one final time? Are we drawing to the end of our conversation? Is there anyone sitting there bursting to make a general comment who has been holding back while all these questions are going on? That's one. Anyone else? That's two. Right, okay. Well, let's take those two general comments and then a third one, and then anyone else who desperately thinks of something important, and then I'll ask you to come back. Is that all right? Okay, so those who asked those last questions, he's remembering. Go.
First of all, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it. It's more of a question that parallels yours. Did you do any comparative work with any other types of communes? And specifically, and this will come to surprise to some here, is specifically anarchist communes.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I wasn't going to make a general comment until there was such a plethora of anti-communal remarks by people included in their questions. And I just thought, given the variety of different forms of commune that you describe or refer to, and the fact that it seems to me that people have been gathering together to live with like-minded, quite idealistic people, certainly what I'd say from the late 19th century onwards and still today, I just think that we should be a bit more positive about the possibilities of communes and communal living. Certainly people were doing it in the 60s and 70s. I'm sure they're still doing it today, in fact even more so because of accommodation problems, which is one of the other things we talked about in terms of Russia and the pressure on accommodation space. But I just think that, I reckon that there were probably quite jolly communes, and that it doesn't sound like a horrible way of living to me at all, to live with people that you think you can see some way forward towards improving the way of life. And I think when you commented about somebody saying they couldn't stand the thought of carrying on living with their parents after they graduated, well, fair enough, and I hope that, we can actually look on this as something that can still have a future now, and certainly wasn't necessarily a total collection of prigs in college rooms. I'm sure they'd have liked bigger spaces if they could have got them.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, I read something by Trotsky many years ago, so my memory of it might not be that well, but he was saying that as you move more towards communism, as the economic kind of pressures
on families, and he was assuming that family life would continue in much the sort of nuclear family way.
Speak that way a bit more.
And
Thanks.
as we move towards communism, the economic pressures on families tend to decrease. It would actually reinforce the kind of tendency towards a small nuclear family, because they would hold together much more voluntarily rather than having been pushed together through economic necessity. And therefore this rather, I felt when I read this, that this kind of almost goes against the idea of these forms of communal living, and that you would actually have but not the lasting, almost like nuclear families, but in the far better conditions for them to last themselves, and to also to relate to other families as well. I'm wondering if this was discussed at all at the time.
Okay. So I think we're coming to the end. Anyone else with a general comment or a last-minute question for Andy? Otherwise, I'll ask him to wind up. Anyway, they'll be able to catch you in the bar afterwards, right? There you are. Okay.
Okay, I'll try and remember this and see if my notes bring it all together. Other student groups, or other students generally. Some of them are perhaps living an element of protected lifestyle because, again, the limited dormitory room. Some are apparently swapping sexual favours in order to get the larger rooms. Such things are going on. There are cases of conflict because, again, they do see these other groups as privileged and annoying or interfering in their lives. Some of them are, committed socialists but not committed activists. I mean, there are numerous kind of relationships going on all at once. We're not dealing with a bunch of activist bourgeoisies that they can conflict with, but there are points of tension, points of difference about how you use the space that is available to you. That's kind of way of shortchanging there of an answer, but there are many things going on there. Coming back to the point I've lost you about whether. Again, but you're saying perhaps these groups are a bit too isolated. Are they, if I understand the question right, are they
just having kind of limited kind of ambition in terms of,
right?
It seems as though living well is an end in itself.
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't accept that. They would expressly say that they are not islets of socialism. They are, as I kind of hinted at before, they do have this kind of set boundary where they want to perfect themselves. They want to make themselves the new socialist person to then go out into the streets. So the Taylor's timetable will tell them when to wash their hands, but it'll also tell them when to go out and to partake in literature campaigns to help illiterate people learn to read, to go out into the dormitory and to cajole people to discuss socialism. So I don't think they would accept that. And I think what you also need to remember is that part of this cultural revolution, it comes down to the importance of the word culture in Russia. It's a much bigger word in many senses. And this idea that to be cultured in the 30s, again, this idea of kulturnost, of culturedness, is a key component of what a revolutionary should be, and how you should live your life. So there's far more weight on the word culture in this context than perhaps from a kind of British Western point of view, especially from today. So culture is embedded in the political mission of socialism as far as they're aware. So they wouldn't accept the distinction between kind of lack of ambition domestically and external activities. Exchange of peoples, that's a fantastic question. Again, from the evidence I've seen, the growth really does come from Petrograd. Therefore, you have people that have come from the periphery, if we can use that phrase, that have come from different spaces. Balyezin, I forget where he's from, it might be Saratov, I can't quite remember, but they've come from many places. They've brought different cultures with them. There are exchanges in that sense. Haven't seen about exchanges perhaps between commune groups from different cities, because again, the main spread of this comes more at the end of the 20s. Again, it comes when there are industrial activities to go and partake in. Those industrial activities, the growth of the new cathedrals of socialism, i.e. the factories, are the new things that you take pilgrimage to. Perhaps there are rituals happening here. You know, so that's where an exchange takes place. So I haven't come across evidence of kind of intra-commune relations.
I think, wasn't your question about like maybe communes in Germany or France or somewhere, and it was outside of the borders of the old Russian Empire?
Outside the borders. No, not so much there. Thinking back, I may have come across a mention of a commune trying to celebrate their sense of internationalism by, as they put it, celebrating the fact that they had a Jew, they had a German, and they had someone else, I can't remember what, but they were trying to make out that they were international. But it wasn't really about exchange again. They're trying to play on what's there, over-egg what's there, really. Where else are we? Comparisons between communes, yeah, that links. This is something that I actually plan to look into now. So you're kind of preempting my next move. In terms of anarchist communes, I mean, there clearly were some anarchist communes in the early days. Again, what distinguishes them from these groups are that these groups have ties with the Komsomol. They want to be revolutionaries. That they don't want to reject the system. They don't want to reject the state. And then that becomes, again, what I've called this meme. But there certainly were these anarchist groups around. It's increasingly unlikely that they will, do much beyond 21. But there's certainly points of comparison there. There are obviously comparisons between all communal groups that develop. There's a certain desire to simplify life, to emphasize brotherhood, to promote a certain kind of ascetic, simple lifestyle. There are then differences, perhaps, between you talk about 19th century communities going across America. There's a difference between isolating yourself as a commune or an intentional community and waiting for the second coming, and perhaps these groups trying to be intense concentrations of what the rest of society will become. There's a difference there, but there are a number of kind of shared commonalities across all commune groups that I think is very worthwhile studying, which is why I intend to do it. And then finally, where are we towards the end here? Can't read my own writing. I think what you're talking about here in part with Trotsky is this idea that as you eventually rid the exploitation inherent within relationships, they will become something more akin to companionship. The very structures of love will get rid of a bourgeois inherent exploitation between man and woman, for instance. So that's the kind of progression that's being discussed there, and that's something that they do discuss in a way, again, when they're talking about love, when they're talking about how relationships should be allowed or whether they should be allowed at all. They're playing with those ideas. They're not necessarily enacting exactly what Trotsky said or exactly what Konantai said, but they're playing with a more general discussion of those themes, be it from the press, be it from word on the street. They're playing with those ideas. I think that might conclude.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much, Andy. I have an announcement about the next talk. Does anyone else have anyone burning effigies of Trump or any other worthwhile activity that they might want to encourage the rest of us to? Oh dear. Well, of course it is the holidays. So, okay, so no notable activities of that kind coming up. Okay, so the next talk, well, first of all, thank you very much. That was great. You have been interrogated by this very perceptive group here, and no doubt that will continue in the bar. It's the Institute of Education. Anyway, to follow the crowd, you would all be very welcome to join us there. It's a student bar. It is not room 202, but it is a bar. The next talk, Thursday the 26th of January, here at Birkbeck. So it's a bit of a while, we get through the holiday season. And so having gone forward a little to the 1920s with Andy, we now go back to 1917. This is kind of hardcore the revolutionary period as the revolution is in full flow. The talk is by Sarah Badcock, who is Associate Professor in History at the University of Nottingham. The title is Kaleidoscopes of Revolution, Russia's 1917 Revolutions in Regional Perspective. The sort of blurb she sent us is the talk will explore what studies of the revolution in the regions of this enormous, diverse country have contributed to the way we understand the broader narratives of 1917. In particular, it will address questions of agency and political power, popular and state violence, and the impact of war. And Sarah went down out of Moscow. I mean, it's so easy for those of us who sat in the archives in comfortable Moscow to do our research. Sarah went down out of Moscow and spent, a long time in the archives in Nizhny Novgorod, and that contributed to her book, Politics and the People in Revolutionary Russia, where you get a real feeling from the book, and no doubt from her talking, about what actually happened in this quite small, by comparison to Moscow or Petersburg, city during the revolution, the interaction of peasants, the countryside, the townspeople, workers, and so on and so on. So strongly recommend that. Please sign up on Eventbrite. We'll do all the kind of technical stuff, well, give us tomorrow, and certainly by the weekend we'll have up a new Eventbrite page for that talk. It helps us to get an idea of the numbers, make sure we have a room here that's at Birkbeck that's big enough, and thank you very much.